Today is Thursday, November 19th, 2015. My name is Ann Peskin, and it is my honor and privilege today to interview Judy Fishman for the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Good morning.
Hi, how are you?
Please give your name.
I'm Judy Fishman.
And where were you born?
In the Bronx, New York City.
How old are you?
Do I really have to tell you?
No, you don't.
I will, because I'm proud of it. I'm 78.
Great. Tell us a little bit about your grandparents.
My grandparents, I have two sets of grandparents that immigrated here very early on. The first set came from the Austrian Empire, right? In 1881, they were the first wave to arrive in New York, and they came with their parents and met and married here. And the second set came in 1906. My grandfather did not want to serve in the Tsar's army, and they came from what is today Belarus.
Now tell us a little bit about your parents.
My parents were born actually they were born in Manhattan, both of them, and grew up partly in Manhattan, and then my grandfather bought a house in the upper part of the Bronx where we had probably 100 different relatives that hung out together. My grandfather was the first in his generation to buy a home. And then in 1943 he retired to Rockland County and bought a farm. And so we again had the place that everybody came to meet. That's on my mother's side. And on my father's side, my grandparents, I'm told, really adjusted well to the country. But by the time I knew my grandmother, she did not speak English because she had had brain surgery. And so to me, they were this very old European couple, which apparently is not who they really were, but that's all I knew.
Now, about your parents.
Yes. My parents, we started out in the Bronx. My father was a civil engineer. He graduated from, tell me the name of the college again in New York that's free for engineers.
Cuba Union.
Cuba Union, right. And my mom was a housewife. She didn't like being a housewife. I think she was misplaced in time. She would have rather been a now woman.
What was your family's involvement in politics or in the community in any service?
Not very much at all. My mother had no involvement in politics at all, nor did my father, and his involvement in the community was predominantly in the Jewish community. He was a very active congregant in Kew Garden Hills where we lived, and he worked with kids. He liked working with kids.
What was your dinner conversation?
I don't think I remember. Probably what went on with my dad at work. My dad worked for a company that had got government contracts, and so sometimes he would leave in the morning and not tell us where he was going, and he would fly to Washington and come home in the evening and let us know that that's what had happened. Because when we left the Bronx, we lived near LaGuardia Airport, and so he could do that very conveniently.
Now, where were you born, and when did you come to Fairfield County?
I was born in the Bronx. I grew up, my more memory is that my teen years in Queens. I grew up in a community called Kew Garden Hills. I went to Forest Hills High School. I used to take buses because we had no schools in the community where I lived, but when I went to college, I walked to Queens College. And then we came here. My husband and I came here quite by accident in 1963. Actually, the weekend that John F. Kennedy was assassinated was the weekend we moved to Stamford. It was, that's why I remember the day so clearly. And we came here because we could afford to come here, and we could not afford to buy a house in Westchester County. We tried.
Did your education influence you in your politics up here?
No. My involvement in politics had to do basically with Ellen Kamhai, who discovered me as a stay-at-home mom and said, "Are you out of your mind? What are you doing staying home all day not doing anything?" And it was 1969, and I had 3 kids under 5. So she was right.
And who were your, if you had any political heroes when you were growing up?
I didn't, because I had very little involvement in it. I do remember the day that FDR died. I remember where I was, and I remember being moved at the idea of it. But I don't think that I really knew very much about politics at all. not at all.
And now if we look at politics, how would you define politics?
How would I define at the moment?
Either now or when you were very much involved?
When I was very much involved, there seemed to be far more trying to find meeting grounds, negotiations, and now I have the sense that it's at an absolute deadlock. I don't see how we're ever in our country ever going to get out of this polarization. It bothers me greatly.
Hopefully Ryan will help. When and why did you decide to go into politics? I know you mentioned Ellen.
Right. She basically was the reason. I met her at the League of Women Voters. At the time that I was in the League of Women Voters, most of the women who in Stamford went on to be in politics were members of the League at that time. Because it was a time when women were not yet working. Certainly a lot of women were home with children, and they were educated women, and they needed something to think about and something to become involved in. And the League seemed to offer that. But many of those women ultimately said, hey, wait a minute, we're not doing anything in the League except studying, and we need action. And so at the beginning of the 70s, those women who were in the League wanted action and started running for office. And Ellen had become chairman of the Education Committee, which was very important to me. And I had no desire to be out in politics. She did. But I knew numbers, and we started with school budgets and testified for school budgets. And she, again, she would look to me to do all the analyzing of all the numbers. And I loved it. And I liked what she believed in. And so it was very comfortable for me to say, okay, tell me what to do, I'll do it with you. And that's how I started.
What party do you belong to and why?
The Democratic Party, because I think they're the party that cares about people, and that, and it represented all the things that mattered to me.
What was the offices that you held?
I never held, I shouldn't say that, I held, the elected office that I held was the one that nobody knows anything about. I was in the 16th district. I have always lived in the 16th Stamford Municipal District, and I served on the city committee, and I have spent numerous times trying to explain to people what it is that the city committee does and how important it is for people to care about the city committee, and most people don't, because you don't get to vote for anybody most of the time unless they come through one of the political committees. And the political committees over history have made it really tough for independents and non-affiliates to be in office. And so being on the city committee, to me, was really, really important. I got to interview all the candidates. I got to interview all the people that sat on any board or commission in the city of Stamford. And you didn't get there if you were a Democrat unless you came through us.
You said when you talked about numbers, what kind of numbers did Alan tend to give you that you would analyze?
That I gave her, right. We would look at the city budget. It was a time in Stamford, it was just before Stamford became the very sophisticated and corporate city that it is today. It was really not the kind of a city that we all know in 1963, unless you grew up here. And the people who grew up here were very resistant to what was happening. And they certainly were resistant to the size of the school budget, and the numbers of schools we had. And actually last night when I was thinking about researching what we were going to talk about, I found testimony that was exactly what we're talking about, where I had to look at the budget. We had a budget director at the school district, a finance person, who Ellen and I quickly decided didn't really understand what was happening and couldn't present it in a way that got it passed. They went from, I don't know how many schools they used to have, but when I testified there were 24 schools in the community. And it was $55 million at that time in comparison to what it is today. But the city was not anxious to have it go up at all, in spite of the fact that all the people were getting paid more and all the services that everybody demanded. They wanted their roads fixed. They wanted everything to happen, but they didn't want to pay for it. and particularly a large group of teachers who lived in town who wanted more money, and they were planning to strike to get more money, but they didn't want to pay more taxes. And they couldn't understand the relevance, how it was related. And so that's how I started.
How long did you serve on the city committee?
I thought I served longer, but according to my notes, I started in 1980. And I stopped 3 years ago. So that would be 2012. It was long. It was a long time. And part of the most important thing that, apart from the candidates and all, was the election district. The 16th district is a district that votes a lot. We have probably the highest percentage of voters of any district in the city. And so it was very important to get in touch with all those voters, because we knew they were going to vote. And so my house was the 16th district headquarters during all the elections. And candidates who wanted to win the 16th often came and worked out of my house, because I had the lists and I knew who voted and who didn't vote, and that was what we did. That was the nuts and bolts of politics.
So how'd you get them out to vote?
By having 10 people, 12 people in my house who knew a lot of people in the district, preferably who lived in the district, and called at 10 in the morning and at 2 in the afternoon. And my favorite story is one woman that I knew, she had nobody to take care of her children, and it was 7:45, and Sandy Goldstein, who was running for mayor in the district, mayor in the city, she came from my district, she wanted to make sure that couple voted. So I went and I took care of the children so that the wife could go out and vote. And the husband, they both went to vote. It was maybe 5 minutes of 8.
That's one great memory. Do you have another memory that you would like to share?
Not like that one.
That was good. Now, what were some of the obstacles that you faced?
Obstacles? I don't remember obstacles. Not at the level that I was. There really were no obstacles. None at all. It was as hard as as I was willing to work, and nothing really was in my way. I guess at the beginning the obstacle was trying to make a dent in the Democratic Party, which when Ellen started, and again I was like a soldier in her army, was a very ethnically controlled party, and everything was negotiated to make sure that all the right major ethnic groups in town were represented. And it was hard to break into that. It was really, really hard. So that's the only thing that I remember at the beginning. And then once that wasn't an issue anymore, it was always an undercurrent, but it wasn't really an issue anymore. There was nothing hard.
Now, you were telling me how you were able to stay on the committee, and you had a second person that could you tell that story?
Right. And it relates to what I just talked about. When there was a woman who lived in the 16th a long time, her name was Lois Lertzman, and she was another Jewish woman, and she moved to New York and left the seat vacant. And at the time, Sandy Goldstein was on the board of reps from the 16th. Ellen had become not yet chairman of the party, but really active in the party. Lynn Laitman was active in the party. So you had these Democratic women who really were looking to make it more comfortable for more Democratic women to be there. And so they asked me if I would serve on the city committee, and I said sure. And they thought, because the city committee was self-perpetuating, that Lois would be able to nominate me and I would be on the city committee. But there was another woman who represented the Irish Democrats in town, and she said no. And they tried to say to her, there's always been one Jewish person in the seat and one non-Jewish person, there were 2 people. And she said no. So that made the women, again, the Jewish women who were active in politics, angry. And they said, well, then not only will Judy run for the Democratic City Committee, but she will get a partner to run with her, and we will win, which is what happened. So a person named Carol Donovan ran with me, And we actually ran an election, and we had to raise money, and we had to have postcards, and do all the things that candidates do to run. And I served for 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, Betty did not take a candidate again. At the end of 2 years, she ran, but we were not giving up our seats. So Carol and I ran as a team, and Betty didn't have anybody running with her. And so I won and Betty won. I mean, Betty had been in the seat for many years. And after that, we never ran again. And Ellen made it so that we couldn't continue. That was a rule that she instituted in the city committee, that you had to go back to the electorate every 2 years. You couldn't just be there. And so every 2 years, we had to get petitions filled out, and we had to go to ring doorbells, because she said it was important to know who the electorate in the district was. And so we would go back to the district every 2 years to get maybe 80 or 90 or 100 signatures, depending on what the population of the district was.
You talked about getting money. How did you raise money? And about how much was it?
It wasn't a lot. It was maybe several $100s. A lot of it you fund yourself, and then maybe you get friends to give $5, but it wasn't major. It wasn't like running for a public office. There's nothing written about it in the newspaper. It was a quiet, behind-the-scenes thing to do.
Were there main issues that city committee got involved with? I don't know too much about it, so it would be interesting.
Well, when you ran for Board of Education, you had to come into the city committee to be interviewed. And if you had if there were more Democrats who wanted that position than just the number of seats that were available, the city committee were the people who made that decision. I mean, we saw that in the last election very clearly, because there was a Democrat who came back to the city committee looking for endorsement and did not get the endorsement for whatever reason, doesn't relate to our conversation. And so that made the city committee important, because you couldn't be on the ballot as a Democrat unless the city committee nominated you. The second thing that I didn't do until later in my serving, was I became chairman of the appointments committee. So if you wanted to be on the zoning board or the planning board or any of the other volunteer boards and commissions, and you were a Democrat, you couldn't get that seat unless you came through the Democratic City Committee. We had appointment interviews every month. We would then bring the names before the full city committee, and they would approve or question it. And then I personally would hand deliver the list to the mayor, whoever the mayor happened to be, and we would talk about who the candidates were and why they wanted to serve. And then the mayor from there took it the rest of the way through the Board of Reps. So again, something that most people are totally unaware of.
Yes, the whole part of the city committee is very, very important.
Yeah, how the democratic process works at the nuts and bolts level, at the bottom level.
When do they have their meetings?
We met on Thursday nights, one Thursday a month, and we met in various places before we started meeting. We never met at the government center. We met in restaurants. We met always in a public place, never in nobody's home, because there were usually there were 40 people. That's how many served on the city committee. The same number as serve on the Board of Reps. And then we started meeting at the senior center. At the end, we were meeting at the senior center, but that wasn't until the government center was built.
Now, you mentioned the Board of Reps. Did the city committee have any connection with the Board of Reps?
Mm-hmm. The city committee members were the ones who appointed and who chose the two candidates to be on the ballot from their district. So there were two of us from the 16th district, and we got to pick, and we got to nominate them. It was also our job to try and find people who were willing to serve, which was not always easy.
No. So really, city committee is behind a lot of the politics.
Correct. And the Republican Town Committee on the other side, right. And we never got involved in each other's business. They got to choose their candidates, we got to choose our candidates.
Now, what was the proudest moment when you think about it in your career?
Well, where I really learned it all was one time, Sandy Goldstein was the 16th district representative on the Board of Reps for a lot of years. One of the times she ran, I chaired her election committee, and that's really where I learned what it was all about. And she won, she always won, and she won with about 92% of the electorate in the 16th district that year. I was real proud of that.
What did you have to do to make that happen?
I had to find the poll workers. I had to make sure that all her postcards were signed. At the time, I think we would have postcard parties. If there were coffees, if she was appearing somewhere to meet people, I had to arrange that. I can't even remember when it was. It must have been early in the 80s when I first started.
Wow. The parties or at each home, how did they work?
When candidates came to coffees?
Yeah.
You would find somebody in the district that you felt had connections to people in their smaller neighborhoods rather than the whole 16th. And the 16th is an odd district because it goes from Longridge Road to Newfield Avenue, and it cuts through the middle where there's no road that cuts through the middle. There's no way to get from Newfield Avenue to Longridge Road through the 16th. You have to go either north of the 16th or south of the 16th to get across. So we would try and find somebody in the neighborhood. I lived once in Castlewood Park, which is on Longridge, so I'd find somebody in Castlewood Park who was willing to have a coffee and would invite their neighbors, and that's how the candidates met in the individual neighborhoods.
Now, what was the most regrettable moment?
How it ended for me was regrettable, really regrettable. Because I had that particular year, once I retired from teaching, we started to travel in the fall because we didn't have to travel in the summer. And I was away, and before I left, I said to then chairman of the party was Jim Diamond, and I said to him and whoever was running the office that I wanted and was willing to have the 16th district election day in my house, as I always had, but I would be gone until about the 27th of October, but know that that's what I'm planning. And I came back, and I went to the night before the election, the Sunday night or Monday night before the election, as we always did, and we got a packet of the latest voter books, which we would spread out on the table so we could mark who voted. And I showed up as I expected to, and I didn't get a packet. And I walked up to Jim and I said, "What happened? The 16th district's been in my house since probably 1980. What? Oh no," he said, "you didn't want to do it." I said, "That's not true. I told you that I did want to do it." Jim had moved into the 16th district. He lived on, I can't remember the name of the street at the moment, and he put it in his house. And he wasn't there because he was the party chairperson. He was at party headquarters. And he said, "But you are going to work, aren't you?" And actually I did. I went there and I worked with a group of people who did not understand the process, young guys that they got, who really didn't understand the process. And it was a quick tutorial about what's your job, what are you doing here, and what's the purpose of this. I stayed an hour or two, and I left and went and worked out of Ellen's house, as I have done other times before I had it in my house. And I said, "I'm superfluous. I'm done." And that was the last time.
That is sad.
Yeah, that was the last time.
You were talking about the process at the day of election. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah. It was always the idea of the party that we would start to call people to vote at 10 in the morning, and that we would call them until they went out to vote. So we would call at 10, and then I had the entire district laid out on the table, and I had 3 or 4 or 5, however many people, and we would, every hour, I would go to Turnip River and get a list of who votes, which most people don't realize is available to you. And so when we would call them up and they would say, "We voted," we would say to them, "Unless you voted in the last hour, you're not recorded as voting, so go vote." And people, they would just insist they had voted, and we didn't give up. It didn't matter what they said. They would get called regularly, and we would try and, in advance, identify who the strong supporters of a candidate were, particularly when it was the governor or the president of the United States or the mayor. We were real anxious, so there would be polling, telephone polling, usually the week before, and people would get marked with pluses or minuses or a little note that says, don't call at all, we don't want them to go out to vote particularly. And we would harass them until they went and voted. And I was, one of the things I remember when I first came to town was Lois Lertzman, the person who was the me of the 1960s and 70s. And I would say to her, I'm not going to vote until 5 o'clock. She wouldn't care. She would still call me at 3, and she would, or somebody from 16th District would call.
Was being Jewish a help or a hindrance in your political career?
I don't think it mattered, again, because of the time. I think that it probably was harder before I got there. That's my feeling. But at that time, there were a number of Jewish people in politics. The mayor was Jewish, although people often said nobody realized he was Jewish. They assumed he was Polish because his name was Polish, and that's how he got elected. But I didn't think it was a hindrance. It wasn't a hindrance to me.
Going back to your family, your children, are any of them in politics?
No, but they all worked. No, not true. My son didn't. My grandson, when he was 2, worked under the table at Sandy Goldstein's mayoralty race. He sat under the table and collected the garbage that everybody would throw. And he learned how to say Sandy Goldstein for mayor when he... it was, my daughter lived on 4th Street, and headquarters at that time was somewhere on Summer Street, and they could walk to headquarters, so.
But nothing really?
No, my daughter, actually, my daughter who lived in Stamford, served on the city committee from her district, from the 11th district.
Okay.
And, but she was asked to run for Board of Ed, but we both had the same feeling, which is you have to be willing to have your name written in the newspaper and to be able to have terrible things said about you, which are true or not true, and not be thrown by it. And I never, ever wanted that. I couldn't imagine that, so.
Now, do you think of a legacy that you left behind?
Not particularly, no. No, I mean, I was a soldier in the trench. Soldiers in the trench don't leave legacies. They just do their job. And that's how I saw it. I had a job to do, and I did it gladly, and I had fun doing it. No legacy.
Well, we're coming to the end. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think I covered it. Again, it was the right thing for me to do at the right time, and it was fun while it lasted.
It was a pleasure.
No, I do have one thing.
Yes.
The one thing about politics that I loved, that we talked about, Ellen and I talked about it a lot, was it gave you a good sense of the community and context with people that in other endeavors you might not have. It was different. It lets me know people in different sections of the city that I might not otherwise have ever met if it were not for politics. And for that, I was grateful. I really enjoyed that.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
So did I.